All right. What's another word for additive? Additive inverse. Opposites, right? So the additive inverse of 2 fifths is what? Negative 2 fifths. Just the opposite. Okay, then we talked about multiplicative inverse. And what's another word for multiplicative inverse? Reciprocals. And so the multiplicative inverse of, let's say, -7 is what? -1/7. So you take the reciprocal, right? So the reciprocal of 7 is what? 1/7. And so you keep the sign. It doesn't say anything about taking the opposite. So the multiplicative inverse of 7 is -1/7. All right, so on that worksheet you just got, you should be able to do that box. This right here. So let's look at this though. What is the additive inverse of -3n? 3n. All right, there's 3n. So the additive inverse. Here's all you do is take the opposite. The opposite of -3n is 3n. What is the multiplicative inverse of 3n? 1 over 3n. Okay? All right, so you should be able to do this box. So 4 through 8 you should be able to do. All right? Yes?
Is it the same if you have a negative fraction?
I'm not sure what you mean by a negative fraction. What are you talking about?
Additive and like say if you had like -2 over 3.
Okay.
Is the same like do you do it the same way like you would do for addition and the multiplication inverse?
Okay, so whenever you find the additive inverse, you do what to that term? Change the sign.
The opposite, so it'd be
Okay, opposite. You change the
positive.
sign.
Mhm.
Okay, so the opposite of -3n is a positive 3n.
So and then when you do the multiplication one,
That's reciprocal.
You flip the numbers or do they stay the
The
same?
numerator becomes the denominator. The denominator becomes the numerator.
Okay.
So 3n is the same thing as saying 3n over 1, right? And so then the additive inverse then would be 1 over 3n. Okay? All right. Okay, so you should be able to do 4 through 8. We've already talked about 1 through 3 last class period. We talked about most of 9 through 13. We're working on that. Let's look at this. Okay, so the next property I want to look at is still dealing with additive and multiplicative inverse. So if you had something like this, and this is number 86, and you had -3/4 times -4/3, and you're told that's equal to 1. All right, you're told that's equal to 1. All right, so remember the multiplicative inverse says this. That's what it says. It says a times 1 over A has to equal what? What do you think?
A times A over 1.
Okay, A times, no. Okay, so if I have, what is 4 times 1 over 4? It's 1, right? That's 4 over 4, which is 1. So 4, and if you look at 1/4, isn't 1/4 the multiplicative inverse of 4?
Yeah.
So if I multiply two numbers that are multiplicative inverses of each other, what should you get? What should that equal? It should equal 1. All right. So if you look at 86, they want to know what property is applied here. -3/4 times, and what is this right here? The multiplicative inverse of -3/4. When I multiply them, it's equal to 1. Okay. So what property says that multiplicative inverses, when multiplied together, is equal to 1? The multiplicative inverse property. So the answer here is multiplicative inverse property. Okay, so that's 86. Then there's the additive inverse property, and it says this. Remember, when you think of additive inverse, you think of opposites, right? And then in the word additive is the word add. So if I have A plus its opposite, and what's the opposite of A? Negative A, what should that equal? 0. Okay, so A plus negative A is equal 0. So in terms of a problem that you would probably see would be something like this. And just write this example. 2/3 plus a -2/3 is equal to 0. So if you look at 2/3, and if you look at -2/3, right here, 2/3 and -2/3, those are opposites, right? What am I doing to those two numbers? No, I'm adding them though, correct? The operation is addition, and when I add opposites, what does that equal? 0. So what property says that when you add two additive inverses together, their sum is 0? Additive inverse property. Okay, so the additive inverse property. Then we looked at this. Okay, write this example. We had this. All right, so tell me what property applies here. You have, it's not an additive or inverse. Don't think it's one of those. But you may have to go back and look at your notes. Okay, so 8 times 1 equals 8. What property is this? Say it again. What was the first word? Identity property. So the identity property multiplication. So remember, the identity property multiplication says if I have a number and I multiply it by 1, I get the identical number back. So that's the identity property multiplication. Okay? So you should be able to okay, what about this one? What's this one? What property says -6 plus 0 is an identity property of addition? All right, so the identity property of addition. So you should be able to do all of these now. That's on 9 through 11. Right. So you have to use those properties. Now notice, do not abbreviate. So if it says the commutative property of multiplication, you got to write out commutative property of multiplication. Okay, so don't abbreviate. If it's the associative property of addition, write out the associative property of addition. Don't just put commutative property. You gotta say commutative property of either addition or what? Multiplication. You have to say either the associative property of addition or multiplication. You have to say the distributive property. Whatever the property names are, say it. Okay? All right, so that was part D. Now let me give you part A. This will be part A.